Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. Former student of mine contacted me the other day. He started dating a young woman and getting to know her. And he said, she wanted to talk a lot about doing her own research. And she showed me a website, and I wonder what you think of it. And I went to it, and it was a conspiracy theory site about how the vaccines cause cancer and they can be reversed with essential oils or something like that. And he said, okay, I see the red flags here, but I don't even know how to talk about this. And that's what I want to talk about today with the person I would most want to ask such questions to. And that is Francis Collins, who's one of the world's leading scientists and geneticists. He founded BioLogos, a ministry dealing with science and religion. And he led the Human Genome Project from 1993 until 2008. From 2009 on, he was appointed director of the National Institutes of Health, and he served 3 presidents, Obama, Trump, and Biden, until 2021. And that happened to be, you might remember, the time of the greatest global health crisis the world has seen in at least 100 years. And now he has a new book. I know there are a lot of you, because I've heard from you, who have read The Language of God and benefited from that. He has a new one called The Road to Wisdom on Truth, Science, Faith, and Trust. Francis Collins,
Hey,
thanks for being
Russell,
here.
it's great to be on your podcast. Thanks for the way in which you get a lot of really good information out there in front of the world. I'll try not to ruin your track record today.
Okay. I sent you the other day a screenshot that I took of a book club that we're part of, that Tim Keller, very last meeting that he was ever able to make. And I took the screenshot because I thought I wonder if this will be Tim's last meeting. But what was striking to me is he's there at the National Institutes of Health receiving immunotherapy. I can see the picture of him leaned back with his hand sort of behind his head in deep thought. Don't know what he was talking about, don't remember, but I know it had something to do with Jesus and with the way of Christ from a technological facility that never could have been imagined scientifically at any point in human history. And realizing what we have there is the coming together of serious faith and serious science, and that's what the book is about. And so I was struck by the fact that you dedicated this book to Tim. I
It
think that was
seemed
appropriate.
like exactly the right thing. He had a lot of influence on me in terms of deciding to actually sit down and start writing. I had wrestled with the idea of trying to say something about what's happened to the polarization, the divisiveness, the loss of anchors to truth and science and faith and trust. And Tim said, Francis, you just have to do this. And I spent a lot of time with Tim in his last couple of years because he spent a lot of that time at NIH in this very forward-looking experimental protocol for immunotherapy of his pancreatic cancer. He did get, for a while, a wonderful benefit where the cancer just melted away, but unfortunately came back a year or so later. But he never wanted to talk about cancer when I was in his room visiting. It's like,
Right.
okay, let's just push that to the side. Let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about how the Bible has wisdom in this tortured state that we're in right now. And let's talk about how you, Francis, could help with that by occupying some kind of a niche there of a scientist who's a believer and maybe trying to bring some kind of rationale to our current circumstance and bring people back together to a place where we're called to be, from the words of the Sermon on the Mount, as opposed to the place where we seem to be from the words of politics.
You mentioned the fact that being in the space as a scientist and as a believer, there are a lot of people who are kind of
Mm.
surprised by that, especially, I mean, you're not just a science, you've mapped the human genome. I mean, you're kind of the uber scientist, and yet you're a Christian when I'm sure a lot of people that you went to school with, a lot of people that you serve with would say, "Well, I'm a scientist. I deal with objective, hard facts, and I believe what I can see and what I can test." Why are you a Christian?
Well, I'm not quite the dinosaur that might suggest, or unicorn maybe. It's from various surveys. It looks as if 30 or 40% of working scientists are believers in a creator God, of various versions of that. It gets less and less prominent amongst people who are in the National Academy of Sciences, perhaps because they're even more enthralled with science as the only way to discover the truth. Most people assume, Russell, that I'm probably a Christian because that's how I grew up and had that experience, and it came to be part of me and it just stayed. That's not my story. I was not raised in a home where faith was considered relevant. I was an atheist by the time I was a graduate student studying physical chemistry. And then I went to medical school, and I entered as an atheist and I left as a Christian. And that was very much influenced
Mm,
by coming face to face with death on a daily basis as a medical student, sitting at the bedside of good, honorable people who were afflicted by heart disease or cancer or diabetes, strokes, terrible things. And I thought of myself in that situation and realized I would have no real foundation to rest upon. And yet, the people around me who had that kind of faith seemed to be at peace about it. And they knew that our medical
mm,
ministrations weren't going to save them, but that was okay. They had another savior. And one of my patients, an elderly woman who I confess reminded me of my grandmother, and I felt rather attached to her, shared her faith with me almost every day. And then at one
mm,
point turned to me and said, "You never say anything when I'm talking about my faith in Jesus. What do you believe, doctor?" Just like that.
mm,
People listening to this podcast, anybody ever ask you that question, sort of right straight to you? What do you believe? Well, I'd never been asked
mm,
that quite that way, in such a sincere, loving outreach. And it shook me right down to my toes. I
mm,
stammered something like, I don't really know. And I got out of the room. And then it haunted me for days, weeks. I had to do something so that that wouldn't happen to me again. I was an atheist. I should be able to defend it. And I realized I hadn't done
mm,
that work. I had not really done the kind of due diligence that a scientist is supposed to do before you make a conclusion. So I embarked upon what I thought would be a journey that would make my atheism even more defensible. And to my surprise, over 2 years, ended up becoming a Christian instead, finding that there was a lot
mm,
of evidence for faith, and some of it was from science. Things like the Big
mm,
Bang, the fine tuning of the universe, the fact that mathematics works to describe beautifully how matter and energy do what they do. Looks like a mind is at work here. And then
mm,
I had to really study the world's religions and try to understand, what do they say about this God that's beginning to emerge as a possibility. And the person of Jesus emerged from that search as truly unique and one that I could not ignore. Very much in the C.S. Lewis version of this. And C.S. Lewis had a big influence on me at this point, reading Mere Christianity and then others of his books, that it was not acceptable to simply say Jesus was a great teacher. He was, as they say, or as Lewis says, liar, lunatic, or Lord. And ultimately, for me, the only real answer was Lord. And so, to my great surprise, at age 27, I became a Christian and have been so ever since. And frankly, have never found any reason to discover a serious, irreconcilable conflict between what I know as a rigorous scientist who will want to see your data before I'll accept your conclusion, and a person who's very much dependent upon the scriptural basis of Christianity as a rock I can stand on in terms of what my faith is all about.
Were your fellow scientists thrown by the fact that you'd become a Christian, or did they
They were
even
thrown.
know for a while?
I was in this moment of wild excitement. I wanted everybody to know, and I wanted them to do the same journey of discovery, and they were not likely to see it that way. Predictions were made that this is going to be short-lived. That here's a guy who studies genetics of all things, and now he says he's a follower of Jesus. Well, his head will explode shortly, and then we'll see what's left.
You were, of course, Tony
Mm-hmm.
Fauci's boss, a figure who might be as polarizing as almost anyone, maybe second to Donald Trump in American life. I know people who have Tony Fauci Christmas ornaments, and I know people who think that Tony Fauci is the devil.
Mm.
Almost. Well, one of the reasons I think that some people feel that way is because they look back and they say, well, there are things that people said that the government and the experts said, that's ridiculous, that's a conspiracy theory, or that's not wise practice, that then they turned around and said, well, yeah, it is. So don't wear masks. Masks aren't going to do anything. Then everybody
Yeah.
should be wearing masks. Then masks don't do anything. Or one that people will bring up a lot is, well, if you get the COVID vaccine, you're not likely to get COVID or to spread it. And then later, well, yeah, actually you are, but it won't be as bad. Or, well, the idea that maybe there was a lab leak in Wuhan is ridiculous. That's a conspiracy theory. To there's legitimate debate as to whether it came from here or there. How do you respond to people who have that kind of concern
I
looking
totally get
backward?
it. And the examples you give, I think, have troubled a lot of people where they felt like they were getting jerked around by messages that were one thing yesterday and a different thing today and maybe a different one tomorrow. And we failed, I think. I failed as one of the communicators to warn people that that's the way it was likely to happen with a virus that we'd never seen before, that we were learning about sort of hour by hour, and that also had this nasty propensity to keep changing its coat. So that things that you knew about the original Wuhan virus didn't turn out to be all that applicable once you got to Delta, and certainly not to Omicron, which is sort of like starting all over again. We didn't quite know that that was going to be such a problem, but there was some suspicion it could be. Every time that we gave a recommendation to somebody about what to do today based on the data we have, there should have been a caveat saying, look, this is the best we can do right now. We have so many things we don't know about this virus. We may well have to change this recommendation. Don't be surprised. But the combination of feeling the urgency of thousands of people dying every day and wanting to try to have some influence to stop that terrible tragedy, and the fact that the media doesn't really like you to have a comment that goes on for more than 20 seconds means that those caveats didn't happen. It should have been, in many ways, a wonderful national, worldwide lesson about how science works. That you have imperfect data, you generate a hypothesis, and then you do some additional data gathering and try to see if your hypothesis was right. And if it's not, you change it and then start down another path. That's what we were doing, like day by day during all of 2020 and a lot of 2021. But that wasn't apparent. And people just thought, these people don't know what they're talking about, or worse, they're actually manipulating us for some purpose. They desire power over us. And let me be quick to say, I know absolutely nobody in the public health system that was trying to manage this on behalf of the federal government, the states, the local counties and cities, who was doing anything other than trying to save lives, trying to do the best they could with terribly imperfect information, all the while being attacked to the point of worrying about their safety. And for those people, especially Tony, who was such a remarkable leader in that space, to be vilified, to be in some way scapegoated when the virus was the evil partner in this. And somehow in some people's minds, no, the virus was fine. It was just Tony. What happened to us that it would be okay to draw that conclusion?
James Davison Hunter talks about in his new book, Democracy and Solidarity, about negative
Hmm.
solidarity. Sort of the country rallies around here's the enemy. Do you think that one of the reasons that things became so divided is because a virus cannot be personified, can't be seen, can't be Osama bin Laden? The figure that we're all fighting against, or is this just the way the
I
world
think it's
is right
mostly
now?
the way the world is, where everything becomes a reason to be angry and fearful. After all, go back to polio. We had no problems in the 1950s seeing polio, a virus that you couldn't see either, as the enemy, and to celebrate the remarkable achievement of the polio vaccine by Jonas Salk. It was like a national celebration that went on for days. Contrast that with COVID, another virus that was terribly threatening to humanity, and yet the progress there became immediately, or almost immediately, a source of people arguing about what was true and what wasn't, and putting some people in the box of being in favor of the right things, and other people were dangerous and potentially not trustworthy.
Here's what worries me. None of us were expecting COVID-19 pandemic, and people celebrating New Year's
Hmm.
Eve 2019 going into 2020 couldn't have imagined what it would look like. What if we were to have another global pandemic with another unknown sort of virus? How on earth would you even start to rally the country or rally the
I'm
world now?
deeply worried about that, Russell. Scientifically, I think we're probably better prepared because of what we learned. The whole mRNA vaccine platform, which had never been successfully used until COVID, is now seen as incredibly powerful. It's being used for lots of other illnesses, used for cancer now to build cancer vaccines. And it takes many months off of the process of vaccine development. There was a serious effort in the early parts of 2020 to try to understand how we might map out 100-day program. So it'd be 100 days from when you first detected a new pandemic pathogen to have a vaccine ready to go. That's dramatic goal scientifically. With a lot of resources, it might just be achievable. But I'm much more worried about
Hmm.
the public reaction. Suppose, Russell, the next pandemic really is influenza. If you had to bet, that's what it's going to be. And suppose it was an influenza like 1918, which spreads very rapidly from person to person by respiratory route, and which is highly dangerous, not just to older people, but to young people as well. 1918, lots of people died in their 20s and 30s and 40s. The only real public health response, if that were to happen again, would be extreme measures to try to prevent transmission, which means basically asking people to stay at home, to put on masks, all of the things that people are now railing against in terms of closures of businesses and schools would be absolutely essential to save lives in that first 100 days. But do you think the public at this point is prepared to accept that,
No.
even if the data is overwhelming? I'm afraid not. We are so suspicious now of everything to do with public health.
It seems as though any time a celebrity of any sort dies, I can just count on it. I can open up any social media platform and there will be people who will be saying, well, it's because they got the vaccine. It was the COVID vaccine that did it. And there will be a lot of people who will have that kind of thing. Uh, COVID vaccine will give you heart trouble, or COVID vaccine will change your DNA,
Hmm.
or those sorts of things. People might say that. Someone might even say that in a small group gathering, say Bible study. People are and someone says that. Most people aren't scientifically trained, don't really know what to say. So how do you know when something like that is said, whether it's true or it's not?
This is part of what I hope to address in this book called The Road to Wisdom. Wisdom, of course, is more than knowledge, but you got to have knowledge to get to wisdom, knowledge of what's true and what's
Hmm.
not true. So we need to agree that there's a standard of truth that can be established by data and evidence, and that doesn't care about how you feel about it. It just is. Sometimes it feels like we've even lost that standard in some places. For something like a scientific conclusion, science is a reliable way to actually dig into the possibilities and come up with answers that you can be confident are true. Science makes mistakes, but they're self correcting because somebody's going to check on anything that really matters and see whether they can replicate it. So, sort of the foundations here that I'm worried about. First of all, truth. Is there such a thing? Yes. And especially if we're talking about established facts, that is not one of those things where you can say that's true for you, but it's not true for me. It's either true or it's not. And again, it doesn't care about how you feel about it. Science is one way to discover that truth. Faith is another way to get access to transcendent truths, like why am I here and what's God's plan for my life and what's the basis of morality. Put all that together, and I think you have a good program for developing something that might be personal wisdom. But then how do you decide what to add to your stock of wisdom? And that's where trust
Hmm.
comes in. I think your question about people getting attached to information that doesn't have a strong foundation really comes down to, who do you trust? What's your standard for deciding that a particular claim should be brought on board and considered to be part of your established knowledge? Um, I think the way we evaluate trust, or the way we ought to, depends a lot on the integrity of the source. Is this a source that has a tradition of being honorable and truthful? The competence of the source. Do they actually have expertise, or are they just making stuff up? And then the third one, Yuval Levin got convinced me of this one, an American Enterprise Institute panel that they ran, is humility. We look for that, don't we? You want to be sure that your source is not just claiming they know everything about everything. The celebrity who's now going to tell you what kind of diet you should have to prevent cancer when the celebrity's goal is being in a movie probably ought to sort of light up a little alarm there. So, okay, integrity, competence, humility. But there's one other feature that I think right now has taken an outsized role in our decision about who to trust. It's like, are they in my bubble? Do they share my political values or other kinds of values? Are they part of the chamber that I live in, which has a lot of echoes of information that's all sort of comfortable? And if they're in some other bubble, those people I'm not sure I really trust. Maybe the information might be right, but I'm going to ignore it. And this is just human nature. This is our ability to
Hmm.
be afflicted with cognitive bias in very powerful ways. But I think they're particularly powerful right now when we are so divided.
Well, suppose, for instance, you have someone who's sitting down in that Bible study, and someone says, there's all this talk about
Mm.
climate change, and climate change is not real. And or if it is, it's natural and it's cyclical. And look, here is some studies done by the Center for Climate Change or whatever, and they demonstrate that this is just the pattern of the way things have gone. And here's an article about some studies showing that climate change hasn't happened. And think about all of the things people once said, oh, we're going to have a new ice age, and oh, we're going to have overpopulation. Now we're dealing with underpopulation. And so this is just more scaremongering. Okay,
Yeah.
forget the issue. How does the person at that Bible study even start to figure out
Yeah.
how to think about it?
It's a great way to pose the question. And part of what I'm trying to do in this book in the last chapter is to give people some strategies about how to address a conversation like that. It doesn't do any good to go at people with a frontal attack about, well, your facts are all wrong, and let me convince you how stupid you are. People basically dig in their heels, get offended. You have a backfire effect where they're even more committed to what they had just said. One of the things that I think is particularly helpful, and you already sort of alluded to this, is to say, so tell me where you've gotten the information that you've just shared with me. I'd like to know your sources because that's critical. And they will lay out. And then you can say, well, okay, I have other sources that I've looked at. Maybe we should take some time and look at the data that comes from these different places and try to figure out who's right, because it is the case that 98 to 99% of scientists who are working on climate change agree that it's quite real and quite serious. And so there's something else going on with the information that you've received that seems to be in conflict with that. It'd be good to know what that's about. Are the 99% wrong, or is there something that about your source that maybe has some sort of conflict? To sort of do that by first listening, then trying to understand where the objection comes from, and then in a thoughtful way saying, can we come together and discuss? It won't always work.
Well, how would you get to the point of figuring it out yourself? Because take climate change off the table, because most of us have at least basic views about what we think about that. Suppose there is a new influenza virus that comes out, and suppose there is an untested medicine for it. And someone comes in and says, look, these experts are saying that this medicine may well give you cancer. How do you figure out what sources to trust when it comes to answering that question and what sources not to trust, even before you start arguing it with each
For
other? How do you
yourself.
figure it out yourself?
Again, I think it comes back to that question about integrity, competence, and humility. And if you look at the available sources, and particularly competence, you're looking for somebody who's putting forward that information who has credentials. It's almost become trendy these days to be snobby about expertise, that experts are somehow elitists and somehow therefore they're not the same as us. If you don't have expertise, if you haven't spent some time really throwing yourself into an issue to understand the details and the nuances, you can be easily misled. So you want to find a source that has that kind of deep expertise before you decide to buy into what's being said. And all too often, what's being said on social media comes from a source that really doesn't have that expertise, but is really good at firing off some kind of a post that gets people fired up. And those are things to really beware of and be careful of, and certainly don't distribute to create another viral experience of a post that's actually wrong. But it is tough. And I think for the average person, sometimes not so easy to assess. What is the competence? If somebody has an MD, does that mean that they're therefore to be thoroughly trustworthy? No. If you look at the dirty dozen of those who spread the worst examples of COVID disinformation on the internet that caused a lot of people to pass up the chance to take a vaccine, several of those were people with MD after their name. And they were making money on this, by the way, by selling other kinds of alternatives that were going to do no good, or certainly wouldn't do as much good as what the mainstream science would tell you. So look for the mainstream. If somebody tells you that they're in unique possession of information that everybody else who claims to be an expert has missed, beware. That's probably somebody who's got an agenda. And it might not be an agenda you want to be part of.
Well, and the questions are about to become quite a bit more complicated. Ray Kurzweil's new book, The Singularity is Nearer, talks about
Yeah.
nanotechnology and his prediction that by 2040 we'll be neurally connected to our what we now have as devices that are external to us. That most of medicine will be done internally with nanobots, and even that eventually we will be able to upload our brains to the cloud. That sounds ridiculous and silly, but so did an iPhone in 1982, I'm sure. So are things about to change pretty dramatically with AI? And is that going to make this problem worse?
AI is certainly going to have a profound impact on many aspects of our life, and certainly when it comes to information sharing, either information that's correct or information that's been made up or is being manipulated. I worry about that a lot. Some of the other scenarios that you've just quoted from Kurzweil's latest version of the singularity is now nearer, I think are unlikely to happen at the scale that he's talking about. Biology is really complicated. You can build an iPhone and you know exactly what's in there. Our knowledge of how the brain works, we are working hard on that, but we are a long way away from understanding enough about it to even say how you lay down a memory and retrieve it, or what is the nature of consciousness. Those are unsolved problems. And to suggest that a mere 16 years from now, you're going to download your brain to a computer and live there forever. I'm sorry, Ray. I like Ray. I know Ray. But I think this one is predicting things that are not on this timetable going to come to pass. They're interesting to talk about and to speculate about how much do we want that. So I think when it comes to the risks of AI, it's much more in the space of how that is going to result in making misinformation even more widespread, telling the difference between facts and fakes when AI is producing a whole pile of fakes, and the facts are going to be harder and harder to tell the difference. We are all going to have to be much more wary, and we haven't been very wary so far. So I'm really worried about that part. And of course, it can be manipulated by unfriendly agents like foreign countries or just people who want to manipulate us for various reasons, oftentimes for political reasons.
Well, and even what we see and hear. The technology is getting
Yes.
so much easier to have if COVID-19 were to happen, say 2 years from now, it's probably likely that there would be a video of you and Tony Fauci plotting to take over America by shutting down businesses with your face and your voice. And people would have no way to know this is just a completely made up AI construct. That's going to make it a
Yeah,
lot more difficult.
it certainly will. And then we haven't even talked about whether AGI, the actual development of machine intelligence that is superior to humans, is a real possibility or not, or whether that's still out there in some vague possible future. I do think that is an area that deserves a fair amount of consideration. If machines really do arrive at the point where they can outstrip us in terms of their capabilities and have self awareness, I have a little page in the book about a conversation between an engineer and his apparently very far advanced computer, where the computer is being asked, "Do you have a soul?" And the computer is basically saying, yes. Now, skeptics would say the computer just knows how to read through the internet and figures out what kind of answer would scare people, but it's pretty spooky.
Well, I mean, there was an AI priest able to a chatbot able to talk people through their faith, and it became a heretic. They had to shut it down very quickly. I mean, we're in very different
Aren't we?
territory now than where we have been. You know, one reason I think why some Christians are skeptical of science, I think this through, is because they would say, well, scientists are often repudiating the text of Scripture, the final authority that we as Christians have on issues such as whether human beings were created by God or whether they evolved from lower species. And one Christian might say, I just can't make sense of the book of Genesis and that. And I will have scientists who will say to me, well, you can have both because Genesis 1 and 2, that's metaphorical and that's poetic. Well, how do I know to do that with Genesis 1 and 2? And I don't do it with the ending of the Gospels of the resurrection of Jesus, which is a scientific biological claim too, that dead body came back to life. And they're wondering, how do I sort that through? What do you
I
say to
think
them?
those are really important questions, and I know they vex a lot of people who are trying to figure out, can I be both a Christian who trusts the Bible and a scientist who trusts the laboratory to teach me things about God's creation? I find that to actually be a solvable problem as long as one is very careful about a couple of things. One is to recognize that science is limited in terms of what kinds of knowledge it can generate. It's got to be knowledge about nature. Science is not any good at answering questions of a more transcendental sort and shouldn't therefore be implicated in such conversations. Otherwise, you're committing scientism instead of science. When it comes to reading of the Bible, I think one, over the course of many centuries, has to recognize with something called hermeneutics that there's a reason to pay close attention to the language of particular parts of the Bible, to understand who the audience was that first read these words and how they would have interpreted it. And that certainly comes true with Genesis 1 and 2, where the idea that this is intended to be a description of the Earth's formation in literal 24-hour days, 7 of them, is a relatively recent assertion, particularly the American church, coming initially out of Seventh-day Adventists, and which is not embraced by many other readings of this long before there was any science to contest it. Go back and read St. Augustine, who was obsessed about the book of Genesis and trying to understand what was meant there, and actually put out a very explicit warning about let no one try to say they understand precisely in literal terms what Genesis is describing, lest some new discoveries prove that to be wrong, and then faith collapses as a result in a totally unnecessary way. Well, that's kind of unfortunately a warning that has not been adhered to, and we've seen things like that happen. I'm completely comfortable with reading Genesis as a remarkable description of God's plan for creation and the beauty of creation that we were gifted. I like John Walton's view of this, the lost world of Genesis 1, that this is describing a temple that God is coming to inhabit, namely our earth, and that it was not by the original readers expected to be a book of history or of science, but a book about God. I think of the Bible as teaching us really important questions about why. Why are we here? And science provides the opportunity to answer, well, how did that happen? And the two together seem like gives us a gift we would not have otherwise have. I think the laboratory is also a cathedral. I like Bacon's argument that God gave us two books, the book of God's words, the Bible, which I read almost every morning, and the book of God's works, which is nature, which I get to study in the afternoon in the lab. And how could those two books be in conflict if they have the same author?
Well, of course, but the one book does teach us that dead bodies don't come back to life. So how do you have confidence then that the New Testament Gospels and epistles are making a claim that is objective
It's an
and out there?
astounding claim, and it was one of the things I struggled with when I was moving from atheism to Christianity. But then it occurred to me, if I've already accepted that God is the creator and put in place all the natural laws that I as a scientist get to study, if there's any possibility of those laws being briefly set aside, it's because God would be able to do so and would want to do so. In that regard, miracles become less of a threat to my scientific mind if they are clearly consistent with a message from God himself. And what would be a more significant message than the resurrection of the Son of God? And I am completely comfortable with accepting that, not as a metaphor, but as a literal rising from the dead. And of course, it helped me reading Tom Wright's remarkable book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which goes through all the historical arguments, which also says this is a very compelling way to look at the evidence and say it really happened. I think it really happened.
There's also a great video of you and Tom Wright singing and playing the banjo together, which I just don't think is fair in the distribution of gifts, that you should both be a scientific genius and have musical talent. That's just not. You should have one or
Well,
the
we
other,
could debate
not
whether the
both.
musical talent measures up to any kind of standard that would cause a concern about distribution of gifts.
The book is called The Road to Wisdom,
Yes.
so it's a road. It's not here's how you are wise or not wise. how do you know as a person? Just forget all the scientific questions. Just as a person, how do you know if you're becoming wise, if you're making any progress toward that, or if you're moving
Yeah.
backward?
And again, I'm writing this book as somebody who's on the road and certainly far from having achieved what ultimately I would hope to. I'm very fond of that verse from the book of James, chapter 1, verse 5. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all willingly and without reproach, and it will be given. Okay, I'm asking every day. And again, the definition of wisdom I think of is knowledge, but on top of that, understanding and a moral framework that you attach it to. And wisdom, therefore, gets you beyond simply having facts to being able to look at a really complicated situation and try to make a judgment about what's the right thing to do, not just in a mathematical way. I think of, Spock is the guy who kind of represents knowledge. Yoda has
Mhm.
lots of knowledge, but more than that, wisdom. That's in a strange way what I'm trying to encourage people to aspire to, including myself. And the book aims to try to put in place some of the tools that you've got to get you there, some of which seem to have gotten a bit frayed. And that includes this ability to discern truth and to tell the difference between objective truth and an opinion. And it certainly includes the opportunity to survey scientific outputs and decide what is reliable there. But it's also about faith. I'm deeply concerned, Russell, that our faith communities are in a rough spot right now, where the
Mhm.
divisiveness that so affects our society also affects the church in a way that sometimes seems like the opposite of what we are called to as Christians, where vitriol breaks out instead of love. And that
Mm.
surely, as Christians, are we not in the best position to try to turn around the current polarization that is contaminating almost everything in our societal discourse? If we can just grab back onto the Sermon on the Mount and live that out, including both loving your neighbors and loving your enemies, that's in there too, then perhaps we can take a
Mhm.
lead in a healing that our nation desperately needs. All of those things put together, plus this recurrent theme about how do you figure out who to trust, I see as the tools you need to move along that road to wisdom. And sure, I occasionally run off and find myself in the ditch and have to pick myself back up and get back on the road, or maybe I slip back a bit. But it's a worthy journey. It's something we're called to. Read the book of Proverbs. It's all about what this is aiming for, is the effort to try to find wisdom as a calling to all of us. I think if we did more of that and maybe less watching social media, we would end up being a better community, a better group of faithful Christians, a better nation, a better world.
Sounds like wise words to me. I am thankful to God for your wisdom and your humility and your faithfulness to Christ. Francis Collins, thanks for being here. The book is called The Road to Wisdom on Truth, Science, Faith, and Trust.
Thanks, Russell.
Thanks,
Great to
Francis.
talk to you.
We started out this conversation talking about Tim Keller. One of the things that Tim would say every once in a while was a quote from the Old Testament scholar Tremper Longman that says basically this: if all that we had in the Bible were the book of Proverbs, we would tend toward being prosperity gospel heretics. And if all that we had from the Bible were the book of Ecclesiastes, we would tend toward being defeatists or fatalists. But we have the whole Bible. And the whole Bible is speaking to all of the aspects of human existence, is speaking with one voice, and is speaking with a voice of wisdom. As Francis said, wisdom's not just a lot of knowledge. Wisdom has to do with being able to make one's way through the world. So if you think about Solomon, for instance, who, on becoming king, asks for wisdom, very thing that James tells all of us as Christians to seek. Solomon asks for wisdom that I may rule this people because I'm but a little child. The humility, the fear of the Lord, the understanding I'm not up for this was the first part of wisdom. And the wisdom that Solomon displayed was not an accumulation of facts. It was the ability to know, for instance, when two mothers were having a dispute about the killing of one of their babies, how to figure out how to discern who was telling the truth and who was lying. That meant a Solomon who knew human nature well enough to know how human beings respond, and who had the presence in that moment to know those two women. That's important for all of us because wisdom is not just a thing. Wisdom biblically is a who. Christ is the wisdom of God and the power of God. And that wisdom and that power far different from the wisdom and power of the world. So when Jesus tells us to get on that road to wisdom, seek the wisdom of Solomon, he concludes by telling us that one greater than Solomon is here. Thank God for that. We'll see you next week.
If you enjoy The Russell Moore Show, take a second to share this episode with a friend or leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Host is Russell Moore. Produced by Ashley Hales. Associate producers are Abby Perry and Mackenzie Hill. Director of Operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens. Audio engineering provided by Dan Phelps. Video producer is Abby Egan. And the theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.